If there is one unifying idea in biology, it is evolution. It explains where we and other modern life forms came from, how similar species suffer similar diseases, and why the flu and COVID viruses mutate yearly, and how certain adaptations work better than others. I think the most beautiful thing about evolution is that all life evolved from a single common ancestor, and that time and natural selection gave us the diversity we know and love today. Evolution refers to genetic changes within a population or populations of organisms over several successive generations. And I must emphasize the following parts of that definition. First, evolution can only affect genetic traits. Things such as learned behaviors,
the way we talk,
and our upbringing are not subject to biological evolution. Next, evolution only affects populations, which are a group of the same species living in the same place. Sorry, you can't evolve.
At least not biologically.
And that's because you are stuck with the DNA your mom and dad provided for you at the time of your conception. Sure, DNA can mutate in your lifetime, but it is mostly either neutral or deadly to your well-being, such as cancer. Also, mitosis only creates cloned cells. Evolution requires genetic changes, which is not possible through asexual cellular reproduction. However, through the process of meiosis and eukaryotic organisms, each generation is slightly different from the previous one, which brings me to my next emphasis: successive generations. A genetic trait must be advantageous, or at least not hindering or killing an organism. Next, the organism with the trait needs to survive and reproduce. Finally, that same trait must successfully pass on through several generations until the majority of the members of a given species have that said trait. This trait then becomes an adaptation, which is a genetic feature that helps an organism in its environment. And this can include our thumbs, enormous cerebrum on our brains, although that one might be a bit questionable as an adaptation if you think about it. For a trait to become an adaptation, it must pass through three filters. Is the mutation helpful? Does the mutation enhance that organism's survival? And finally, does that mutation enhance their reproductive success? I'll use the example of the human cerebrum size. Humans descend from a long line of bipedal great apes from East Africa. To date, the oldest human-like primate is Lucy, an organism called Australopithecus afarensis, who lived around 4 million years ago. What made Lucy and her kind successful was first being fully bipedal, which is thought to help them see across the plains for any predators. Her kind also had a slightly enlarged cerebrum, which assists vertebrates in thought processing, decision-making, smart things. This species had a slightly larger cerebrum than other closely related primate species. Thus, a larger cerebrum was an advantageous mutation because the larger cerebrum increased the ability for Australopithecus to survive. They could gather a lot more resources and thus had a higher likelihood of reproduction. And over several successive generations, Australopithecus had larger cerebrums relative to others, would have more offspring until it got to the point that them and their descendant, humans, all have larger cerebrums, thus becoming an adaptation in human-like primates. And thank goodness for that, because we are certainly not the fastest organism on the planet. I mean, my God, a 50-pound predator could just kick our... By the way, we are the last line of human primates. Many either died out due to changing climate patterns or us, Homo sapiens, being assholes that we are. Evolution is so important to the study of biology that geneticist Theodosius Dobzhansky wrote a piece in the 1973 journal The American Biology Teacher entitled,
"Nothing makes sense except in the light of evolution."
And while that essay may mean little to those learning biology, it's definitely required reading for us bio nerds. So let's see how life evolves and why this process is so important to the study of life. And when most people think of evolution, they likely think of this guy, Charles Darwin. No, not that one, this one. And while the ideas for evolution were organized into the theory of evolution, evolutionary thought preceded Darwin by at least a century. Ideas of species changing over time and even extinct species were already accepted by the scientific community, but there was no experimental evidence to support it. First, it was important to understand that the age of the Earth was quite old, and this span of time allows for mountain building, erosion, and what we now know as tectonic shifts. Scientist James Hutton proposed that Earth's geological forces behave in a slow and gradual way. Geologist Charles Lyell popularized Hutton's slow and gradual Earth idea and suggested that this gave more time for species to change, and therefore the current geological science places the Earth's age at around 4.6 billion years old. So the time that there was for species to evolve, but how did they evolve? The first explanation of mechanism for evolutionary change came from French biologist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And according to Lamarck, traits that are used or unused for an organism in a given environment will change, and that change passes on to their offspring. And while Lamarck was able to show that evolution occurs over several successive generations, and that some of those traits become adaptations, he got the mechanism wrong. Organisms cannot pass traits on that they acquire in their life. They can only pass on genetic traits. In addition, you can also be born with hearing loss, such as myself. If you acquire hearing loss from your environment, you can't pass that on to your offspring. But if you are born with hearing loss due to genetics, that can be passed on to your offspring. Understanding the length of time it takes for geological process to occur as the changing of traits over successive generations, the mechanism for evolution was finally explained and independently conceived by two biologists, Charles Darwin, whom we all know, and Alfred Russel Wallace, who kind of got cheated in the crediting department. I mean, have you ever heard of him? Exactly. Darwin traveled around the world in the HMS Beagle from 1831 to 1836, specifically South America, Southern Africa, Australia, and of course, the Galapagos Islands. Wallace, however, traveled to South America and the Malay Archipelago near Indonesia on two separate occasions in the 1840s and 1860s. On the Galapagos Islands, Darwin noticed finches that lived on different islands but yet looked similar, but had distinctive differences, especially in their beaks. Each bird beak was adapted to eating a specific food source. Thick beaks crush nuts, thinner beaks help obtain insects on plants. He also noticed that those same finches resembled the finches from nearby mainland South America. He suggested that a population of mainland South American finches came to the Galapagos and their descendants evolved into the various finch species there today. He also introduced the world of bizarre biodiversity of this interesting island chain. Yeah, all these pics come from a friend of mine who teaches math. How does a math professor get to the Galapagos before a biology professor?
Because you got kids and bills, man.
Ugh. Darwin and Wallace proposed natural selection as the mechanism for how species change over time. Natural selection occurs when individuals with certain heritable traits produce more surviving offspring than do individuals without those traits, often leading to a change in the genetic makeup of a species. Darwin argued that natural selection was the inevitable outcome due to three principles in nature. First, some traits are inherited from parents. More offspring is produced and are able to survive because of limited resources. And finally, offspring vary among their traits. Thus, organisms with the appropriate genes for a given environment at a given time will fare better than other individuals of the same species due to limited resources in the environment. And I think it's important to clarify something before we move on. Notice I said the appropriate genes for a given environment. You see, nature is fickle. The winner in the game of evolution is not always the strongest, fastest, smartest, or biggest. It's the one whose traits allow them to survive long enough to make the most babies. That's it. Because without babies, you can't pass on your genes, no matter how awesome they are. And so I just described biological fitness, which is the ability to produce more offspring relative to other members of a population. Like Earth processes, evolution is mostly gradual, with each generation inheriting genes that nature selects for. Organisms undergo modification in successive generations, with changes sometimes resulting in the formation of new and separate species. This is called descent with modification. So let's apply the two principles of evolution, natural selection and descent with modification. Let's do it with whales. Whales are a marine mammal group that actually descended, believe it or not, from a terrestrial mammal related to modern-day even-toed ungulates like deer, bison, and hippos. In fact, the hippopotamus is most likely the closest land relative to whales, and this is based on gene sequencing. One of the earliest species of whales was a creature called Ambulocetus. This species likely lived a lifestyle akin to hippos and alligators, being in the water. The long, flattened body with A long snout suggests that this was a lion-weight predator that lived in freshwater habitats but could also walk on land due to well-developed legs. Due to competition for resources by ancient whale-like mammals and other groups, natural selection would appear to select for traits that are better in aquatic conditions. Fast forward a few million years and you get this little creature called Rhodocetus, with a much more streamlined body and limbs as well as webbed feet. Continue forwards even more, and you start to get a whale-like creature called Basilosaurus. Only this time, the back legs are severely reduced to help prevent drag in the water. And notice the body maintains the streamlined look with a long snout, and those features are very important for aquatic conditions. But we still don't know what those tiny little legs are. For some reason, scientists seem to think that it had to do with mating. Finally, we get to a modern whale who has lost the hind limbs altogether. But in some modern whales, such as the right whale, they still have remnants of a pelvis where the hind legs once were. In conclusion, the organisms with traits more favorable for aquatic conditions survived, and each subsequent generation began to look more whale-like. Natural selection requires variation in a population to work. And remember, natural selection only works on genetic traits in a population, not individuals. For example, it is true that the average human height has increased over the last century, but this is not due to evolution, but due to better nutrition. Nutrition is an environmental factor that can affect height. In order for evolution to begin, there has to be genetic diversity. This is achieved in one of two ways. In prokaryotes, such as bacteria, a mutation or a change in DNA is pretty much the only way. In eukaryotes, mutation and sexual reproduction via meiosis is an additional way. Mutations can behave in one of three ways. First, it may hinder an organism to reproduce or even affect their ability to survive. It may have no effect on an organism's overall fitness, or it may produce a new phenotype that is beneficial to an organism's success. Sexual reproduction doesn't produce new phenotypes for a population, but it can sort existing phenotypes within a population. Meiosis guarantees that each offspring, except identical twins, is different from both the parents and siblings. When a new phenotype is introduced and is beneficial to both the survival and reproduction of that individual, it becomes an adaptation. An adaptation is a match of an organism to its environment. Examples include our enlarged crania, a cactus's thick stems for storing and preventing water loss, and this green coloration of this green anole to camouflage in its environment. Adaptations become successful when successive generations express the new phenotype over time to match that of their environment. I want to bring up a phrase I find a bit misleading: survival of the fittest. I mean, it makes sense on the surface. Those who have the appropriate genes for the environment tend to do better than those who do not, and they're likely to make more offspring. However, the environment is constantly changing, so what adaptations exist in organisms today will simply just change as the environment does. Plus, people define being fit based on certain traits like speed, smarts, and strength, and in the end, only the organism that produces the most viable offspring relative to other organisms in their population are more fit because they can both successfully survive and reproduce. I think it's much better and more appropriate to say survival of most fit for now. Evolution by natural selection appears to originate from two sources: common ancestry and environmental pressures. All flowering plants belong to the same plant taxonomic grouping called the angiosperms. There's actually over 300,000 species of flowering plants worldwide, and all evolved from a common ancestor that had flowers. Flowers are the reproductive organs of flowering plants, and most are evolved to attract pollinators such as insects, birds, and fools like us. I mean, isn't it weird that we give floral genitalia as a show of affection? I mean, good thing we live in a universe where the opposite is not true. Anyway, the fact that all flowering plants have flowers is due to divergent evolution, and this is described as evolution due to common ancestry. Another example is vertebrate animals. All vertebrate animals have a backbone or vertebrae. This indicates common ancestry all the way back to simple jawless fish. An adaptation shared by all members of an evolutionary group due to ancestry are called homologous structures. Other examples include opposable thumbs in primates and feathers and beaks found on all birds. So while divergent evolution is due to common ancestry, convergent evolution occurs when two distantly related species develop similar adaptations. Well, not because of common ancestry, but due to environmental pressures. Going back to vertebrates, fish, extinct marine reptiles, and whales all have fish-like bodies. The bodies are streamlined, torpedo-shaped, and all have fins. And while true, they do share ancestry back since we are all vertebrates, the fish-like bodies are due to living in water. Another example are succulents, and I love succulents. In fact, I'm kind of a sucker for succulents, as you can see from this large collection. Ow! Ow! Upon immediate observation, you will notice all succulents have thick stems and some have spines or needles. That's because drier conditions require features on plants to reduce water loss. Succulents exist wherever deserts are, yet they are distantly related both due to geography and having different ancestral points. Analogous structures are adaptations between species that look and function similarly but evolve from different evolutionary groups. You may recall from the genetics video that Darwin and Wallace were not privy to the mechanisms of inheritance discovered by Gregor Mendel. Because Gregor lived a reclusive lifestyle, his data over the pea plants was not picked up until the early 20th century. Darwin and Wallace relied on blending inheritance and other outdated ideas to explain how organisms pass genes from one generation to the next. And once Mendelian genetics was applied and the field of genetics grew, biologists could integrate genetics into evolution and track which genes provide a selective advantage for a given population and which ones don't. Evolution could then be observed at a population level where changes in the genetics of specific phenotypes are tracked, which we call microevolution. And in addition, macroevolution describes the processes that give rise to new species. And so now that we know an overview of evolution, how do we know the theory of evolution is legitimate? Well, evidence. And that's what we're going to do on our next video. Look at both the observation and experimental evidence that explains how evolution occurs.